I wanted to start a little more broadly than just talking about funding. We'll have time to talk about funding in a minute. But we were on a phone call earlier planning the session, and both of you were at the Ag Outlook event last week. And I remember we were talking about the census data and it not being terribly, not an altogether rosy picture with regard to farm, the situation with the small farms in America. And I think it was Tim that talked about there being an optimism at the conference in spite of that fact. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the optimism and I think the sense that you were referring to, that people were ready for some kind of change. So if both of you could address it, but Tim, if you want to start.
Yeah, sure. Well, I've heard Secretary Vilsack give his spiel many times, right, about kind of the vision, and I thought he did as well of a job as I've ever heard it encapsulated with his opening statements of, like, there's a path to grow farms in a different way if we start broadening the value of what we consider this produced, right? And specifically, like, how can you create economic models for environmental outcomes in different ways? And, like, we've got a runway to do this here in Michigan. And flip this whole script on like what we value land production to be. And the advent of technologies that weren't available 5 years ago, I think, makes this more of a reality. There's a lot of pieces from the concept to the final product, right? But I can envision a scenario at the end of the day, like a farmer you deliver your corn and that corn is worth an extra 27 cents a bushel because you hit XYZ outcome that we cared about, right? You limited your nutrient loss. We can demonstrate the fact that you've improved the ground's resiliency through increased organic matter concentrations and you sequestered carbon and we know because you did those kinds of outcomes that your farm doesn't require as much crop insurance indemnities to weather increasingly variable climate, right? And so we've shifted this focus on resiliency onto the farm rather than it being an external factor. And like we've completely changed our economic support systems for agriculture. We're at the point where that can happen. And recognizing the value of diversity in there, of can we get to a place where we care about the fact that we're buying Michigan asparagus instead of Peruvian asparagus, right? And I mean, that quickly becomes relevant to the farm stop discussion here. But I think there's a path for optimism towards a different model than what's been possible in the past.
Yes, I would completely agree. And yes, it was absolutely optimistic. One of the things that's interesting to me, you know, if you've been in this world for a while, the ag census, what's the plural of census? Censi, have been pretty darn depressing for a long time, for my whole professional life. But what's different now is back in the 80s when you got yet more farms were lost, yet more concentration. There really were not out there alternative models that provided any kind of realistic on-ramp for producers to do something differently. I was a state employee and I was referred to publicly as a socialist by suggesting there might be something in connecting local farmers with local markets. Which was super amusing to me because I thought that was the basic idea of capitalism, right? And it also seemed to me like a very profoundly small c conservative idea. What you want to do is keep local food dollars local because that's what builds local economies. So the notion that there's somehow something more efficient by maximizing production, shipping something to one central point and then shipping it back just somehow didn't seem all that efficient to me.
The political spectrum is a circle, right? It's not a line, it's a circle.
So that was a bit mysterious. So what I feel like I've seen happen is correct. We have come full circle and now suddenly people are seeing, yep, there is strength in diversity, not just on the farm and natural systems, but also in economic systems. And there is a strength in deconcentration. You know, you don't have all of your land in one place. Sometimes you do different things in different places. So I actually feel like, yeah, the numbers are a bummer, but NASS is now reporting farmers selling directly, which they had never done before. They're starting to track serious economists. I have an economist friend in the room who would probably laugh about this, are starting to track, okay, what is the impact of local agriculture? What is the real bottom line value add for farmers? What does it mean for job creation in other sectors? Rural America, we're losing hospitals, we're losing schools, we're losing everything. Can agriculture be part of rebuilding economic vitality, which then allows communities to come back to life? So it was optimistic. And I think that the Secretary just does an awesome job of explaining it's not just soil management, it's not just markets, it's the whole panoply of services.
Yeah, and the numbers, right, of NAS tracking that sort of stuff is impactful, right? Like, if you can't measure it, then you don't care about it, right? And so you can't move the needle on it if you don't measure it. And there's been a sea tone, or a sea change here of what we're interested in quantifying as a reflection of our values and what we're trying to prioritize as outcomes.
Right, and if you can't measure it, you can't lend to it, and you can't insure it, which means, but once you have those, then you start really having a business model which can be expanded and can grow.
I was going to ask this question at the end, but I'll ask it at the beginning. This is a relatively new movement, the Farm Stop thing. This is our first conference. If we continue to organize like this and want our voice to be heard, I'm curious to know from your perspective at the state and federal level, what do you want to see from Farm Stops in terms of how do we demonstrate our ability to move the needle on this point? What would make you take interest and think this is something we want to pursue or get behind in a bigger way? What would you like to see?
Well, we're here, so I think you've kind of already done that.
Yeah. But I mean, in terms of data, like what kind of data? Right now, I think we all have our own metrics that we follow, but I don't know that it's any. I don't think there's been any thought given as to how we make the case that what we're doing is impactful. So how you aggregate that data and share it, I don't know.
I spent a lot of time thinking about this, or what are the desirable metrics that we're trying to pursue, and I don't have a good answer to that yet. A little bit of it is I don't want to feel like Columbus here discovering America, like when it was already here, right? Just the fact that I've discovered this is an issue is, but I think we need more definitive numbers, right? And I think a better understanding of how this drives money into economies, I think is really important, right? You bring people along with it. At the same time, understanding that different metrics move people in different ways, right? For some people, and like I've got a science background, I want numbers, right? And I want to use objective measurements in a way that to better defend and justify our actions, right? So that it's not purely subjective. But at the same time, the subjective does move the needle, right? The anecdotes are impactful. I think we've got to be conscious of the fact that at the same time, like we want more definitive numbers to have a very justifiable, defensible approach so we can go to argue to change the status quo in Lansing and DC. At the same time, it's going to be those human aspects and the anecdotes that are important to add context around it.
Yeah.
While the Farm Stop movement is new, it's a natural corollary to other movements that have been around in other sectors. I think about independent grocery. I mean, you all don't define yourselves as grocery stores, but you share a heck of a lot of the bottom line economic challenges that the independent grocers, and actually your numbers are better in some cases. I mean, the number of grocery stores that are lost in rural America and also in urban America is just distressing. And so what they look at is, can this be a viable model? Can you employ people? Can you pay a living wage? Can you return a living to farmers? I mean, that's what at USDA we look at, is it's viable and it's valuable if it's a way for farmers to make money and stay on the land. So I think that's what we would like to see, but I completely agreed with the point that it's stories that you have to have the stories, but you also have to have them backed up by what's the bottom line.
Tim, you alluded to the cost of when you lose farms, what the cost is in rural America. I'm wondering if you could talk specifically about Michigan and how we all read the census data about Michigan, but how does it impact on the ground real Michiganders in small towns when they lose their local farms?
Well, it's a really good topic here in Michigan because we still do grow a lot of food, right? And quantifiable in large acreage in some ways, right? There's a robust wheat production value chain here in Michigan. We grow a lot of wheat. It gets milled in a lot of places. It gets turned into cereal in Battle Creek, and it turns into goldfish crackers in Willard, Ohio, and things like this, right? We grow a lot of dry beans. Acreage on every one of those continues to trend downward. And you see the corresponding rural businesses close in support of those, right? There aren't as many dry bean processors up in the thumb. We look to close flour mills. At some point you end up with small towns that have a dollar store and a McDonald's, right? And you've combined school districts with 3 others, right? And you start taking away a school district, and now you've taken away community identity, right? Because now we have to rename the mascot and everything. That drives it home to people. Like, you want to turn out people to a school board meeting and start talking about changing the mascot. But so I struggle though too, because I don't have a number of rural economies dropped by 37%. Maybe that doesn't mean anything anyway. But I think it has to be of presenting these facts in front of people too, of the fact that you can go get your coffee at the McDonald's for $1.10, or you can go to the local coffee store and you probably have to walk in, right? And it's now $1.30, right? Or it's $2, but there's a cost to that. And we don't think about it in terms like that. It seems like we've been on this path where we're looking at our feet one step in front of the other, and then we look up and I don't look at all where I've been. Like, I don't like where I am now. These are the consequences of actions here.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a question over here.
I want to go back to the metrics piece. So in terms of how we get those metrics to the government, like, I could give you subjective and objective data. I can tell you that one farm who started out working or selling through our outlet worked for Frito-Lay full-time and farmed part-time on literally a quarter of an acre, and then he bought a dying farm and has revitalized it and is now in Bush's. He's at Argus, he's at our store, and that's subjective data. I also have objective data to say his sales went from this to that over the course of 5 years. Where and how would I get that data to the state or federal government?
Well, one of the things that I've discovered, and I've only been at USDA, I'm not a career, I am on a contract, is that you ask for a meeting, you come in and you tell people. Guess what? They'll take your meeting. That's their job. And I assume it's the same way at the state.
I'm astounded. So I've been in this job a year, right? And people are like, well, how did you meet with? They called me up and they asked to meet. Yeah. My email address is boringt1@michigan.gov. We've got it. I think there's been a deficiency in our part over the years of not showing up and listening. Right. And so we're making a concerted effort to do a lot of roundtables. And if 12 people show up and we have a good discussion, that's success. We got to be out in more places talking. Yeah. I want to do a lot of listening. There's too much already data out there. There's way too many experts that have been thinking about this stuff for decades that we need to do a better job listening to.
Yeah, and so in a practical sense, I would say form an association. Associations are very, very effective, and they're very, very efficient because they can pull a whole bunch of data together and they can present it in a way that people who are overwhelmed with data, and by that I mean public officials and elected officials, can incorporate it and take in the pieces quickly. So organize. Yes, no?
No, this is organize, right?
Yeah.
So I left my role at Michigan Agribusiness in 2020. Marvelous timing. It was January. You remember what happened?
I opened a restaurant at the same time, so don't tell me.
Yeah. I started
of
Michigan
losers.
Ag Advancement as an advocacy organization just around issues. And it wasn't for no other real purpose of the fact that it's more impactful when you show up and this is my title and this is my phone number, this is my email address. You create the framework around it in a way that resonates in Lansing and DC.
Yeah.
And the gentleman, I think up here, you have a microphone next to you.
I think
It's coming on right now, I think.
there we are. So we've showed up, you showed up. And here's what I want to say. The Michigan corn growers know exactly what their costs are. They know exactly what their production is, and they know all the whys about it. The soybean producers have these numbers. These large organizations have these numbers. So the request to state, the request to federal is, okay, let's get some more grainy data on the nitty gritty of what those oddball producers are. And maybe the organization through that is the future Michigan Farm Stop Association.
Yeah.
But those numbers that are, Joe Guy and Jane person out in the field that have 3 hoop houses that are growing mushrooms and greens that aren't being looked at, especially in my corner of the state, get looked at. So I put that to you. Those are the questions that need to be asked before, we need the data. Nobody's looking at it. So if you're not looking at it, I think the quote was, what's the impact? If you're not paying attention to the data, if there isn't data, you're not looking at it, it doesn't matter. So it's...
Well, and I think part of it though too is I don't want to say it, of knowing when to follow the data and when to understand the limitations of the data and what the numbers aren't telling you, right? The data is important, right? The data becomes, you can create a much more defensible, justifiable approach of why we're doing this, right? I think, I know on every day, it's the shortcomings in what are quantifiables, what those shortcomings and what the vacuum of data, how that impairs us to have the justifiable approach in the way I want it. And so in a lot of rooms in Lansing, right, we're going in and we're advocating for approaches that don't have the data behind us in the way that would make me more comfortable. But like the work is too important, like we've got an opportunity to seize here, and we're going to move forward without the data because we have a justifiable enough approach for why this is important. And we'll tell the story through a lot of anecdotes and the data that we do have. But I want to make sure at the same time we're building the data behind us to make sure it continues to serve as a defendable approach moving forward.
Right. Before you get to spend the money, you got to know the data.
You have to at least have an inkling that you're not going to be wasting the money, right? It's got to be better than 50-50 chance that it's a good idea. In addition to data and the notion of organizing, I would also suggest there is real power in finding allies in unconventional places. I think we tend to shoebox ourselves into, we are the local food guys. Well, you know what? You're not just the local food guys. You're the rural development guys. You're the independent grocery guys. You're the local bank guys. You are the county economic development guys. There are faith, military, DOD cares about this stuff. There is an organization of retired military people who are horrified at the health because of our countries. They see it as a national security risk because they can't induct enough healthy young people. Well, they went up the chain and said, oh, the food system is part of this. So they will support local food development. They will support things like double up food bucks. So I would encourage you to really think broadly about what you do and the impact of what you do and who else you can make common cause with. And then also I would encourage you to be realistic and not to be quixotic. Because there are organizations that are very, very, very well-intentioned, but burn some bridges by not realizing or making the perfect the enemy of the good, which is perhaps oversaid, but there's real wisdom in that.
I think Paul has the microphone. If you want to.
Want to talk a little bit about and ask a question about bridging the urban-rural divide. Too often it seems that the urban communities, being an urban planner for a good chunk of my career, seem somewhat indifferent to what's occurring in the crisis that's really occurring in rural America, when it actually there's a continual feedback. Families move out of rural America into urban cores, driving house availability, housing down, prices up. So if we can, how do we bridge that urban-rural divide that the USDA and the ODA, or in this case the MDARD, I'm from Ohio, so the ODA. How do you, that it's not just something out there, it's something that affects us here in the urban areas as well, because there seems to be sometimes a disconnect.
I'm trying to be purposeful in how we're talking about economic development and getting away from language around just urban ag, right? Because now, like, rural people don't see themselves in this.
Right.
And the issues that we're trying to solve through our approaches to urban ag, right, are food availability and economic opportunity and like cultural driver. That's regardless of rural urban. I think that's important. Frankly, I don't like our department's name, right? Like, that's not fully reflective of what we do. I think part of our efforts too I put up one of those budget proposals around farm to family, right? Of how can we be talking about this work in a way that urban and rural components both see themselves in it, right? Food processing, there is a ton of Detroit-based food processing organizations, right? Drive a lot of urban economies. If we're talking about these issues and not just agriculture, right? Of farming as rural, well, in a place like Michigan that has a lot of people, and to our benefit, right? Same as Ohio. Like, how do we recognize the fact of the work we're trying to do drives the value system, drives our economies in all of these different places, rural and urban?
Okay.
Well, I just want to I want to give a plug, Mr. Appalachia, to the regional food business centers, and to to USDA agencies like FSA and RD to a lesser extent, but they are in communities and they can work with, for example, counties. Counties will have both urban and rural. There are regional associations of counties. I think leaning into finding advocates whose work touches both is helpful, and the regional food business centers are intentionally supposed to be doing that.
I will take a couple more questions in a second. We're down to, I think we only have like 10 or 12 minutes left, so it's going very fast. But I did want to devote some time to talking about funding mechanisms that are available to people that might be in the audience that want to start farm stops. You alluded to, you had a few slides where you alluded to programs. What's your sense if someone were either in Michigan or somewhere else wanting to start a farm stop, how could the USDA be of help to them? Through which program specifically?
I think that you should look at the local food promotion program and the farmers market promotion program immediately. And I think a place to start would be on the website, you can look at paragraphs that describe projects that have been funded. And that's a nice way to get sort of the gestalt of the program, see what are the kinds of things that they use this money for. So I would start with that. I think that those are immediate opportunities. And while they are competitive, I would be willing to bet that there are people in this room, so within your circle, who have experience, and ask them for feedback. I'm looking at Kate and Alex.
Say the names again.
The local food promotion program, they should be on that list, and the farmers market promotion program. And if the slides are available.
They are. The slides will be available afterward.
You can get those links. The other thing, rural. If there are folks that are interested in doing this in smaller communities, which doesn't have to mean 5,000 people, counties of 50,000 or less, USDA Rural Development has got a lot of money. They are the big funder in terms of both grants and loans and loan guarantees. And I would encourage you to look at what they've done and be in touch with your state office, because, and you know the colleagues there.
Oh, yes.
They could
Yeah.
be helpful.
Yeah.
And finally, I think that you should look at, well, many states have healthy food financing type funding at the state level as well as the national program. So I would check out those options.
We're trying to have a purposeful focus too of capacity building. We have around $3 million minority food and ag grant through our last budget appropriations. And we specifically carved out 2 rounds of funding with that. The first round of funding is going out and funding communities to build capacity to help people write grants at like $50,000 a pop. Because that, like, we've got the money, but the applications are a pain to fill out. And needlessly, justifiably so, like, I want to be defensible with taxpayer dollars. We're going to try to be doing a better job of working with communities so that we're like standing up grant writers to help farmers write grants.
Right. I know there were other questions. I don't know where the microphone is. Oh, if you'd like to go.
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to state that maybe the Farm Stop doesn't have an association, but the Michigan Farmers Market Association works with everybody from someone selling produce in front of their farm to farmers markets to farm stops. I know the name might be misconstrued, but we have support for you guys to get SNAP benefits and produce prescription help and all that kind of stuff. So there's 2 of us here today, me and Julia, so please reach out, have a conversation with us.
Thank you.
I would definitely endorse that, and they've got experience applying for these grants, so they can certainly help.
Right. Who else do we have? Sue, you choose.
I also have a comment. So I appreciate your suggestion about organizing. I would kind of push back on the state and federal agencies around agriculture to train USDA and state people in organizing, because I have people at my USDA rural development and NRCS who have never been to the farmers market. And I went in to ask what programs at the beginning of the season that I as a farmer would be eligible for. I said, can I get on a listserv like ODA has? That's Oregon Department of Agriculture. And my NRCS person said, what is ODA? So the lack of coordination and the lack of USDA people getting into the community and having those organizing skills is really obvious. And I would love to see more of that happen, because I think that what we need is for rural development to have a real sense of what's going on in the community already, and then reach out to the people about the programs, because I don't have time to know what all the programs are.
All right. Who else do we have? This gentleman back here.
My question's about political organization and the most effective way to put pressure strategically on government. So this is kind of to your point that traditionally in agriculture, you organize by commodity. So the corn growers are really familiar with what corn growers need. Soybean growers are really familiar with what soybean growers need, and they can communicate those requests to you guys, to people in government. The farmers that sell at Argus might be growing 20 things. So organizing by commodity might not be the most logistically, I mean, I'm looking at that and it's like, can you imagine if there was like the Celerac Growers United, you know, and it would be total chaos. And I think that is one thing that's leading to our type of agriculture maybe punching below its weight politically. So what I see is that we're pretty socially united, we're economically united, but we're less politically united. I mean, Dave got together a farmer beer night a year and a half ago, and there were 35 people there. And I was thinking, man, if we get in a bus and we drive up to Lansing and ask for money, that would get money. So how, could you guys have any, maybe? Do you guys, and I know that I totally agree that farmers markets are a great way to do that, have some thoughts on how diversified growers that can't logistically unite and advocate by commodity can realistically form a coalition, because most of the growers that I talk to around here aren't members of Farm Bureau. Any thoughts on ways, logistical ways, that these types of growers can organize and present our case to people in positions of authority in either the executive or legislative branches?
You have any beer?
And they should bring that to Lansing? Is that what
Bring
you're
that
saying?
to Lansing too. Yeah, I mean, well, yeah. No, I think it's an excellent question. Those voices haven't had a leadership role in Lansing in the way they've needed to.
Yeah.
Right? I think social media's got the power too to connect people across geographic limitations in the way that we haven't in the past. Like, that's a much longer conversation to go into a lot of detail. But I think, broadly speaking, right, I think carrying those values to Lansing has a ton of impact. It really means something. I think it's taking those messages to the legislature, right, I think is really impactful to help rally support behind a cause and develop more context around what alternative models of doing things can be. And it's, I mean, doors are open in Lansing, ours included, to those perspectives.
You know, it is true that the corn growers have their own association, but they're also part of broader ag associations. They work with Farm Bureau. Co-ops has the National Council of Farmer Cooperatives. So associations don't just organize around their particular product. I think that it is worth engaging with the National Ag Associations, with Farm Bureau and National Farmers Union. I think that every producer ought to be knowing what's going on in their state in those associations and participating. They're both foundationally very democratic. Policy is made from county committees and then gets pushed up. So instead of seeing those guys as the enemy, I think that you should think about working with them. I see a head shaking, and I have been accused of being an eternal optimist, but in democracy, you have to be an eternal optimist, right? If you don't engage, change will not happen. I also think that there are other associations out there that organize across commodities. There's a National Farmers Market Association. There's a National Sustainable Ag Coalition. There are conservation groups. I think that you should, first of all, organize yourselves. Second of all, find common cause with existing organizations with capacity and work together. I think about the Specialty Crop Farm Bill Alliance. Those guys don't always work together on a lot of things, but around the specialty crop, which is fruits, vegetables, tree nuts, when it comes to the Farm Bill, man, they speak with one voice and people listen. And the third thing is I think that you should find out and engage with the national associations in your locality and see what they're doing and participate.
Yeah, I think we are technically out of time, but I see you have a microphone, so would you like to ask one last question?
Well, I was just going to say one thing, as I was going to say Farmers Union, not necessarily Farm Bureau, because I've been down that road in the democracy, but as it goes up the chain, it just gets more and more conservative and moves away from the food we eat, specialty crop. But Farmers Union has all kinds of great programs and all kinds of resources that I think would be very valuable to this group of people.
Thank
And
you.
also, Tim, just one thing. I love that you said value chain, because I wish we could get rid of supply chain, just call it value chain, because we don't want to talk about getting big, drive prices down. We want to pay a fair price, and we want everybody to have access, so we have to build the value.
Well, thank you, everyone. I just once again like to thank these folks for coming. Kate and Tim, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it. We'll be moving on to our next session now. Thank you very much.